Story 1. The Watcher House, Westfield, New Jersey, 657 Boulevard, looked perfect. That house on the tree-lined street in Westfield, New Jersey, had just the right mix of historic charm and modern comfort. Tall, elegant windows watched over a manicured lawn. The brick steps led to a wide porch where rocking chairs would surely sit. It was, to the average passerby, an American dream manifested in architecture, quiet, proud, and timeless. When Derek and Maria Broadus closed on the home in June of 2014, they believed they had reached the next stage of their life's journey. The couple, both in their 30s, had worked hard. Derek was a senior executive at an insurance company in Manhattan. Maria, who grew up in Westfield, had returned to raise her children in the same peaceful town she once knew. The home, purchased for $1.3 million, was a stretch, but they believed it would be worth it. They had 3 young kids, and this was going to be the place they grew up, riding bikes down sidewalks, walking to school, and sleeping soundly behind safe, thick walls. But something was already watching them. 3 days after closing on the house, but before the family officially moved in, Derek stopped by after work to check the mail. The mailbox was still a little rusty. The floors still needed some refinishing. The walls were getting fresh coats of paint. The house was not yet ready for living, but it was becoming theirs. And in the mailbox, he found an envelope. It was white, no return address. The handwriting was blocky and old-fashioned, slightly jittery, as if the writer was trying to remain calm while shaking with excitement or rage. The letter was addressed simply to the new owner. Derek opened it casually at first, but as he read, the casual moment soured quickly. "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard," it began, "allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood." The letter praised the house for its beauty. But then, it shifted. The tone became strange. "Personal, 657 Boulevard, has been the subject of my family for decades now," the writer continued. "I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father in the 1960s. It is now my time." Derek's stomach tightened. It didn't stop there. The letter referenced the Broadus family by name. It mentioned the type of vehicle they were driving. It described the workers coming and going from the house. The writer seemed to be watching everything, and had been for some time. Then the real terror crept in. "Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Have they found what's in the walls yet? I asked the previous owners to bring me young blood. Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me." The letter was signed simply, "The Watcher." Derek stood in the hallway, the letter trembling in his hands. The quiet house around him, newly purchased, freshly painted, suddenly felt like a cage. He rushed home to Maria, showed her the letter. They contacted the police immediately. An officer arrived later that night, read the letter in silence, and looked up with an expression that said what Derek and Maria were thinking. This wasn't a prank. The officer asked if they had any enemies, any disgruntled family, friends or colleagues, anyone who might want to scare them off. The Broaduses couldn't think of anyone. They hadn't even moved in yet. They barely knew the neighbors. The officer advised them not to tell anyone else about the letter for now, not even their new neighbors, because everyone was a suspect. Trying to push forward, they kept preparing the house. Over the next week, Derek and Maria tried to focus on their children and their move, but their sense of excitement was quickly eroding into dread. And then the second letter came. This time the envelope was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Broadus. The writer had now learned their names. "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard." The letter began, "The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings." Then it turned sharply personal. "The children play in the backyard, don't they? I have seen them. I watched as your daughter painted on the porch. One child was using an easel inside. Is she the artist of the family?" The Broaduses hadn't even moved in yet. Their children had only visited briefly. How could someone know these details? The Watcher went on. "It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood sleep in the attic? Or will they all sleep on the second floor? Then the tone grew threatening again. I am pleased to know your names now, and the name of the young blood you have brought to me. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me to know who is in which room. The writer ended with an ominous warning. Let the young blood play again like I once did. Stop changing it, and let it be what it was supposed to be. Signed, The Watcher. Derek and Maria were shaken to the core. They didn't want to set foot in the house anymore. Every sound on the street felt suspicious. Every car that slowed down out front made them hold their breath. Every neighbor they passed became a question mark. Was the Watcher watching them right now? They reached out to the family who had sold them the house, John and Andrea Woods. The Broaduses asked if they'd ever experienced anything like this before. To their surprise, the Woodses said yes, just once. They had received a strange letter a few days before moving out, the first such letter in 23 years of living there. It was weird, they admitted, but they had dismissed it. They'd never gotten anything before, and assumed it was a one-off prank or maybe a mistake. But now Derek and Maria weren't so sure. Was this truly something new, or had it been happening in silence all along? They stopped bringing their kids to the property. They contacted a lawyer. They reached out to a private investigator. They installed cameras and alarms. Westfield police began an investigation, but there was little to go on. The letters were postmarked from nearby, but there were no fingerprints, no DNA. The Watcher had left no trace beyond words. Still, the letters kept coming. In the third one, the writer expressed anger at the renovations. You are destroying the house, it read. It cries for the past and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. And then maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a minor illness that never seems to go away, but makes you feel sick all the time. It will drive you mad. It was no longer just creepy. It was malevolent. The Broaduses could no longer even imagine living there. But who would buy a house with a stalker? And what did the Watcher really want? The Broadus family was now living in a strange kind of limbo. Their beautiful 6-bedroom home, 657 Boulevard, stood ready and waiting for them. The hardwood floors gleamed. The walls were freshly painted. The neighborhood, with its trimmed lawns and American flags, gave every outward appearance of comfort. But inside, the home was poisoned. Maria and Derek had stopped sleeping well. They stayed at her parents' house with their children, feeling like intruders in their own lives. But the unease wasn't just about fear. It was the not knowing. The helplessness of being hunted in the shadows without a face or voice to fight back against. The Westfield Police Department, which rarely dealt with serious crimes, opened an investigation. The first challenge. There were no real leads. No DNA. No fingerprints. No camera footage. The first letter had been postmarked June 4, 2014, from Kearney, New Jersey, a town about 30 minutes away. All the letters came from there. Someone had likely driven outside Westfield just to mail them. Someone who didn't want to be caught. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood. They asked questions delicately, trying not to alarm anyone. But Westfield was a close-knit suburban community where privacy and politeness often overshadowed suspicion. People didn't like being accused, even subtly. One neighbor, however, did stand out. The Broaduses had noticed something strange about the family that lived directly next door at 657 Boulevard's rear property line. An older man in his 60s, Michael Langford, lived with his mother and several siblings in a house that had been in their family for decades. The Langfords were odd by most accounts, quirky, perhaps eccentric, but not dangerous. Michael, in particular, was known for wandering the neighborhood, sometimes peering into windows or walking across lawns. He was unemployed and lived a somewhat isolated life. Still, his house offered a clear view of the Broaduses' property, and when investigators looked deeper into the first Watcher letter, something stood out. The letter mentioned, "I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father in the 1960s. That phrase made investigators raise their eyebrows. The Langfords had lived on the block since the 1960s. It lined up. Westfield police brought Michael in for questioning. He denied everything. He claimed he had no knowledge of the letters, no grudge against the Broaddus's, no reason to harass them. The police couldn't find any evidence to contradict him. Without fingerprints, video or forensic proof, the suspicion was only that suspicion. Still, Derek Broaddus became fixated. He began conducting his own investigation, poring over neighborhood maps, trying to triangulate sight lines from different yards. He even hired a former FBI agent to profile the watcher. The profile they received was chilling. Likely someone older, intelligent, articulate, paranoid tendencies, possibly psychotic, likely lived nearby, possibly had grown up in the area, and deeply obsessed with 657 Boulevard. Weeks passed, then months, but the letters kept arriving. Another one read, "I see that you have already flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors, so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk tisk tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy." At one point, the watcher wrote about the children again. "It has been years since the young blood ruled the house. Have you found all the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood sleep in the attic? Or will all of them sleep on the second floor?" There were even more personal references, things that only someone very close, or someone spying from within the neighborhood, could possibly know. Then the threats became more pointed. "You are despised by the house. It is crying out with the pain of your greed. The house used to be full of life and laughter. It is now soulless." Each envelope bore the same blocky handwriting. Each signature was the same. The watcher. At this point, the Broadduses began to panic, not just about their safety, but about the financial nightmare unfolding. They owned a home they couldn't live in, couldn't rent, couldn't easily sell. And now, if word got out about the letters, the property's value would plummet. Still, they couldn't live like this. They began preparing a lawsuit, claiming the previous owners, the Woodses, should have disclosed the initial watcher letter they received before the sale. The legal battle would become public, and with it so would the story. The media caught wind in 2015, and just like that, 657 Boulevard became infamous. News vans descended on the quiet street. Reporters staked out the home. Articles popped up on every news site from New Jersey to Europe. Who is the watcher became a modern mystery with real-world stakes. Some thought it was a hoax, maybe even perpetrated by the Broadduses themselves, desperate for an out or attention. Others were sure it was a stalker, or a cult, or someone with a grudge, or a former resident obsessed with the past. In online forums, theories blossomed. Reddit threads filled with maps, breakdowns of sightlines, discussions of the letters, and analyses of the real estate documents. The Broadduses were hounded. Some neighbors were sympathetic. Others were angry, furious that the attention brought on by the lawsuit and media coverage was now tainting the neighborhood's reputation. Westfield had always been known for its safety, its charm, its tight-lipped, affluent normalcy. Now, it was known for something else entirely. Under pressure, the police circled back to Michael Langford. But again, there was no hard evidence. The family denied everything. Derek tried hiring another private investigator, one who staked out the post office, and watched to see if anyone mailed letters from the Kearney facility. They hired handwriting analysts, voice experts. They even tried consulting with a security firm about DNA testing the envelopes, but the results were inconclusive. One of the more bizarre moments came when a lab analyzed the DNA on one of the envelope flaps. The results. That was shocking to investigators. Most assumed the watcher was male, based on the letter's tone, but this new clue didn't help narrow it down. Could it have been a Langford sister, a neighbor, Maria herself? As crazy as it sounded, investigators briefly considered the idea that Maria Broaddus could have sent the letters herself, possibly out of stress or psychological strain, but there was no evidence of that, either. No motive. No history of mental illness, just more theories, more fog, more confusion. By late 2015, after nearly a year of torment, the Broaddus's made a heartbreaking decision. They would not move in. Instead, they tried to rent the house. But even that proved difficult. Potential renters would Google the address, and within moments, they'd come across headlines about stalkers, death threats, and letters from someone in the shadows. Eventually, a family did agree to rent, on one condition: if another letter arrived, they could break the lease. And sure enough, a few weeks after moving in, they got a letter. This time, the Watcher wrote, "You wonder who the Watcher is? Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors, who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move." The tone was mocking, confident, triumphant. The Watcher was still watching, still waiting, and still anonymous. By the time another letter arrived for the tenants of 657 Boulevard, public curiosity had turned into full-blown obsession. It wasn't just a local mystery anymore. The Watcher had become a viral urban legend, with the unique haunting twist that it was entirely real, and still happening. The renter, understandably shaken, turned the letter over to the Broaddus's. This one was worse than the last. There was a darker tone in the language, more arrogance, more menace. The Watcher taunted them, referring to the lawsuit and the growing media attention, writing, "You wonder who the Watcher is. Have you seen me now? You are too late. You've already lost." The threat wasn't just to the Broaddus's or their tenants anymore. It now felt like the Watcher was speaking to anyone who dared to look into the case, as if shining light on the mystery only agitated whatever lurked behind the curtain. With each letter, the mystery deepened, but so did public suspicion. Many began to ask a simple but uncomfortable question: what if the Broaddus's made it all up? The theory wasn't just born from skepticism. It was fueled by the bizarre circumstances surrounding the case. A few facts that stirred public doubt included: the Broaddus's had never moved into the home, despite its value and their investment. They launched a civil lawsuit against the former owners, which some critics believed was financially motivated. Despite hiring private investigators, security firms, and even DNA testing, no concrete suspect ever emerged. Some began to whisper, could they be trying to back out of a mortgage, or make money from selling the rights to their story? It wasn't just conspiracy theorists and armchair detectives on Reddit. Even local residents in Westfield, neighbors who'd once been supportive, started pulling back. Derek and Maria were accused of dragging the neighborhood through the mud, of sensationalizing a personal problem into a public circus, and perhaps worst of all, of wasting police time. Westfield had always prized its image as a quiet, safe, upper-middle-class community, a place where you moved to get away from things like this. And now that illusion was broken. The Broaddus family pushed back against the accusations. In interviews, Derek appeared composed, but tense, clearly burdened. He insisted that he had never wanted the attention. He described losing weight, not sleeping, and sinking into depression. Maria, too, was visibly shaken when she spoke about the toll it had taken on their children, who had heard stories at school, or seen news trucks outside their grandmother's home. To the Broaddus's, this wasn't a stunt. It was a nightmare. They said they'd gone through background checks, interrogations, and intense public scrutiny, and had never been charged or found to be misleading in any way. And the most convincing piece of all, the letters didn't stop. Even after they were no longer trying to sell the home, even after media coverage had died down, even after years had passed. If this were a scam or a ploy, it would have had an ending. Instead it just lingered, quiet, creeping, like the Watcher himself. Meanwhile, the town of Westfield found itself at the center of a media frenzy that wouldn't quit. TV specials were aired. Investigative podcasts dedicated entire series to the case. Documentaries cropped up across YouTube and streaming platforms. trying to piece together the puzzle. Then came the inevitable. Hollywood knocked on the door. A production company began developing a feature film based loosely on the case. The rights were shopped around. A bidding war began. Eventually, the streaming giant Netflix won the rights, and announced plans to create a dramatized series titled The Watcher. It promised mystery, drama, suburban paranoia, all the makings of a true crime sensation. And while the project brought global attention to the case once more, it also brought something else: profit. People returned to one of their early suspicions. If the Broaddus's were now making money from a Netflix deal, did that validate concerns that the case had been exaggerated or orchestrated? Derek responded publicly. He explained that the deal was in part a way to recover from the immense financial loss they had suffered, between legal fees, failed renovations, security upgrades, and property value damage. But it did little to quell the whispers. The Watcher case now existed in that peculiar space where real life blends with folklore, a chilling true story warped by time, repetition, and endless retellings. Still, no one had ever been charged. No suspects had been arrested, and the question remained: who was the Watcher? In 2019, after 5 years of fear, investigation and legal headaches, the Broaddus's finally sold the house at 657 Boulevard. They didn't get their money back, not even close, but the financial wound had been cauterized. The emotional one was another matter. To this day, the new owners have never publicly reported receiving letters, which has raised an even more troubling theory. What if the Watcher only cared about the Broaddus family? One detail often gets overlooked in retellings of the Watcher story. The letters weren't just eerie. They were personal. They referenced specific movements, specific rooms, renovations, people inside the home, children's nicknames, clothing styles. That knowledge suggested two possibilities. The Watcher had access to direct observation, maybe from a nearby house, possibly someone using binoculars, or even entering the home, or more terrifyingly, someone had inside information, perhaps from a contractor, a visitor, a neighbor posing as a friend, someone who blended in. The Broaddus's had gone so far as to set up hidden cameras, run background checks on contractors, and even track mailed letters. But every path came up empty. And the scariest part, every professional who reviewed the letters agreed this wasn't a prank. The language, tone and consistency pointed to someone who was disturbed but deliberate, obsessive, not impulsive, someone who had thought about this for a very long time, someone who wanted control, and who had found the perfect outlet in a young family with everything to lose. When asked what they feared most, Derek once said it wasn't violence, not even someone breaking into the home. It was the not knowing, the fear that someone could be watching, and you'd never know. Standing at a window in the dark, parked in a car down the street, sitting in a lawn chair behind a curtain, looking, listening, waiting, just out of reach, just out of sight. That's what made the Watcher terrifying. Not a mask or a weapon, not blood or a breaking window, but the idea that danger could come from anywhere, that someone could hate you, without you ever knowing who or why, and that they might never stop. The new owners of 657 Boulevard, Andrew and Allison Carr, bought the house in 2019 for $959,000, a significant loss compared to the $1.3 million the Broaddus's had paid in 2014. But the Carrs weren't worried. When asked by a reporter whether they were afraid of the Watcher, they simply said, "We're not concerned." It was a strange closing chapter. After 5 years of letters, fear, lawsuits, and public scrutiny, the house that had become a symbol of American suburban paranoia simply resumed its life. Lawn mowers returned to the grass, mailboxes filled with ordinary bills, kids played down the block, and the Watcher, he if it was a he, fell silent. The Carrs never received any letters. No strange figures were seen in the trees. No messages with eerie taunts arrived in the mail. And this silence brought two reactions. To the cars and their supporters, it was a welcome relief. Maybe the Watcher was a hoax. Maybe it had all been a fluke. Or maybe, they said, the Broaduses just had terrible luck. But to the Broaduses, it was more painful, and more confusing, because the silence confirmed something chilling. The Watcher wasn't obsessed with the house. The Watcher was obsessed with them. It wasn't about 657 Boulevard at all. It was about the family inside. The Watcher had watched them, not the structure, not the lawn. Them, they were the story. Not long after the house sold, Derek and Maria Broadus quietly returned to a normal life, at least as much as they could. They bought a new home in Westfield, just a few blocks away, a decision that confused many. Why stay in the same town that had turned on you, that had doubted you? But the Broaduses had deep roots there. Family, friends, school. They didn't want to uproot their kids any more than they already had. Still, their life had changed forever. Derek began writing anonymously about their ordeal, publishing an essay in The Cut that chronicled their years of fear, uncertainty, and trauma. He described what it felt like to be haunted by an invisible enemy, the humiliation of public doubt, the shame of becoming a meme, the exhaustion of constantly looking over your shoulder. At one point in the essay, he wrote, "I used to be able to sleep soundly. Now I listen for every creak." That perhaps is the true legacy of the Watcher. Not bloodshed, not murder, but a different kind of violence. Quiet, slow, relentless. The theft of peace. The dismantling of trust. The horror of never knowing who. So who was the Watcher? 5 years later, we're no closer to an answer. But let's look again at the suspects. Starting with the one the police first investigated. Michael Langford. Michael lived next door to 657 Boulevard, with his mother and several siblings. He had a reputation in the neighborhood. Eccentric, maybe even strange, but not dangerous. Still, his home had the clearest line of sight into the Broadus' house, especially the porch where their children had been playing. A former FBI agent consulted on the case said that many elements of the letters, the formal tone, the old-fashioned phrasing, the obsessive knowledge, pointed to someone older, perhaps in his 50s or 60s. Michael was in that age range. He didn't work. He lived at home. He had time. He had proximity. And he had no alibi for the nights the letters were mailed. Police interviewed him. They even tried a ruse, sending an undercover officer to deliver mail to see if Michael would react when the Broaduses received another Watcher letter, but nothing stuck. He denied everything, and there was no concrete evidence to tie him to the crime. Then there was a different theory, less personal, more strategic. Could the Watcher have been a disgruntled bidder, who lost the home to the Broaduses? That would explain the obsession, the rage, the sense of entitlement the Watcher expressed. After all, in one letter the Watcher wrote, 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession, and now you are too. Broadus family. Could that level of anger have come from someone who thought they deserved the house? But again, there was no evidence. The previous owners, the Woods family, had only received one letter, and that was after the sale was finalized. Then there were other theories, more chilling, more conspiratorial. Could it have been a contractor? Someone who worked on the renovations and overheard personal details? Could it have been a postal worker or delivery person with intimate access? Or perhaps worst of all, could it have been someone the Broaduses knew? A neighbor, a friend, someone who sat with them at a barbecue, or watched their kids at playdates? Someone who smiled, while writing death threats in secret. Even handwriting analysis and DNA tests, tools that usually bring clarity, offered little. A DNA profile was lifted from one envelope, but it turned out to be from a woman. That ruled out Michael Langford. Police briefly focused on his sister, but again no results. The investigation lost momentum. Detectives were reassigned. The case went cold. And the Watcher, he never came forward, never left fingerprints, never bragged online, never made a mistake. He or she remains anonymous.
a ghost in the walls. When Netflix released the Watcher series, based loosely on the Broaddus's story, it was a hit. But like many dramatizations, it took liberties. It added new characters, new crimes, new red herrings. For many viewers, it blurred the line between reality and fiction even more. But the Broadduses made it clear, the real story didn't need embellishment. It was already terrifying enough. They weren't the only ones who thought so. To this day, the Watcher story is studied in criminology classes. It's cited in discussions about privacy, surveillance, and the fragility of modern suburbia. It has become a modern folktale, a parable about how safety is sometimes just an illusion. 657 Boulevard still stands. Its trees still sway in the breeze. The porch lights still glow at dusk. If you drive by at night, you might not notice anything strange. It looks like any other home, quiet, respectable, familiar. But if you park nearby, if you wait in silence, you might start to wonder, is there someone in the window? Is there someone watching you right now? The Watcher's last known letter ended with a line that chills to this day. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick, day after day after day after day. That was the horror of the Watcher, not violence in the moment, but the promise of corrosion, the erosion of comfort, the sickness of fear that never fades. He didn't need to break in, he just needed you to know he was watching, and once you knew that, you could never unknow it. Not fully, not ever.
Story 2. The Murder of Shanda Sharer. It was a chilly January evening in 1992, the kind where even the wind seemed to whisper secrets down the dark, empty streets of Madison, Indiana. The town, nestled alongside the Ohio River, was known more for its quiet neighborhoods than for anything sinister. Families raised their children here, school buses rolled through tree-lined streets, and people rarely locked their doors. It was the kind of place where the past echoed faintly in the red brick buildings, but the present felt safe. At least, that's what people believed, until something horrific shattered that illusion. 12-year-old Shanda Sharer had only recently moved to the area. With big brown eyes, an easy smile, and a love for writing notes and decorating her locker, Shanda was the kind of girl people called bubbly. She made friends easily, giggled often, and tried her best to fit into her new school, Hazelwood Middle School. But starting over isn't always easy, especially for someone so young. And in a world where adolescent emotions can burn hot and fast, things can turn dark very quickly. Shanda had transferred to Hazelwood in the fall of 1991 after her parents divorced. She lived with her mother, Jackie Vaught, who was trying to build a fresh start for both of them. At first, things seemed to be going well. Shanda joined the volleyball team and made friends quickly. But middle school is often a boiling pot of changing friendships, shifting alliances and teenage drama, and Shanda soon found herself pulled into a toxic circle. There was another girl named Amanda Heverin. Amanda was a year older and had a reputation that some called rebellious and others just misunderstood. She and Shanda developed a bond, one that, according to notes and letters later examined by investigators, may have crossed into romantic territory. It was the early 90s, a time when many small towns weren't ready to openly talk about young same-sex relationships. Whatever the truth was, their connection sparked jealousy and rage in someone else. That someone was Melinda Lovelace. Melinda, also 16 at the time, had been Amanda's on-again, off-again girlfriend. She was known for her fiery temper and intense emotional swings. When she found out about Amanda's growing friendship with Shanda, it lit a fire inside her, one that would burn through the lives of everyone involved. Melinda didn't just feel betrayed, she felt replaced, humiliated and furious. And in her mind, Shanda was the one to blame. What started as petty jealousy soon morphed into obsession. Melinda began threatening Shanda, writing her name on notebooks, scribbling messages, and making it clear through both words and actions that she hated her. Shanda, still only 12, didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. She told her mother about some of the bullying, but played it down, as many kids do. Jackie encouraged her to switch schools, hoping to keep her daughter away from the escalating tension. But unfortunately, Danger doesn't always stay at school. On the night of January 10, 1992, Shanda was staying at her father's home. It was a Friday night, and she was looking forward to going to a school dance. Like most girls her age, she cared about what she wore and how her hair looked, and she was full of nervous energy. But as evening came, plans shifted. She ended up not going to the dance, and instead planned to stay in. That's when the call came. Two teenage girls, Laurie Tackett and Hope Rippey, drove over to her father's house in a beat-up car. They had a message from Amanda, or so they claimed. They said Amanda wanted to see Shanda, and that she was waiting at another girl's house. Shanda hesitated. It was late, and she didn't know these girls well, but they coaxed her, saying it wouldn't take long. Amanda just wanted to talk. Against her better judgment, Shanda slipped on her shoes, grabbed her coat, and left the house. She never came back. What happened over the next several hours is one of the most horrific and deeply unsettling crimes in American true crime history. But in this first part, it's important to pause and reflect, not just on what would happen, but on what could have been. Shanda Sharer was not a troubled teen. She was not running away. She wasn't doing drugs or getting in trouble at school. She was a 12-year-old girl in the wrong place at the wrong time, manipulated by older teens caught in a web of jealousy and emotional chaos. And because of that, she would be lured into a nightmare she couldn't have possibly imagined. The car that picked her up was driven by Laurie Tackett, an 18-year-old with a fascination for the occult and a long history of mental health struggles. Hope Rippey, 15, was along for the ride, largely under Laurie's influence. Melinda Lovelace was hiding in the back seat, unseen by Shanda. She brought a knife and rage. Shanda likely thought this was just going to be a short detour, a quick stop to talk to Amanda. Maybe there'd be some drama, maybe not. She couldn't have known that Amanda wasn't even involved. She couldn't have guessed what Melinda had planned. After all, who would imagine that other teenage girls barely older than she was would be capable of what was about to happen? In the quiet of the car, the trap had already closed. They drove her away from the neighborhood, past the streetlights, out of the safety of town. They told her stories to keep her calm. They said Amanda would meet them soon, but there was no meeting. There was no Amanda. There was only what came next. As we stop here at the end of part 1, we're left with that sinking, helpless feeling, knowing the truth of what's to come, but unable to look away. Shanda Sharer had dreams, friends, fears and favorite songs. She was a daughter, a student, a young girl, and she was about to enter one of the darkest chapters in true crime history. The night stretched on as the car rolled further away from town, the streets narrowing into dark country roads surrounded by fields and woods. Inside that cramped vehicle, the tension was almost unbearable, even if Shanda didn't fully realize it yet. The older girls acted friendly enough on the surface, their voices light, but underneath was a dangerous current, anger, fear, and something darker. Melinda Lovelace sat quietly in the back seat, her mind racing. She carried a hunting knife she'd hidden under her coat. It was sharp, cold, and heavy in her hand, the physical embodiment of the anger that consumed her. For weeks, she'd felt pushed aside, replaced by Shanda in Amanda's affections. But tonight, she wasn't just angry, she was determined. Laurie Tackett drove with purpose, her eyes fixed on the road, but there was a nervous energy in her hands. Hope Rippey, sitting beside Laurie, alternated between nervously fidgeting and glancing at Shanda. They were not innocent bystanders. All had played parts in a growing plan, one that spiraled quickly beyond control. The car finally stopped near an abandoned house on a lonely rural road, the kind of place that would go unnoticed by neighbors or passers-by. The darkness swallowed the building whole, broken windows reflecting faint moonlight. It was a place where no one would hear a scream. Shanda was confused, scared, but still holding on to hope. Maybe Amanda was here. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe everything would be okay. The older girls led her inside. What happened next is a harrowing tale of cruelty, fear, and unimaginable violence. For hours Shanda was held captive, taunted, threatened and brutally attacked. The girls who had once seemed like peers transformed into tormentors, driven by jealousy and rage that burned like wildfire. Melinda's hatred turned physical. She stabbed Shanda multiple times, the cold steel biting into flesh. Shanda tried to fight back, screamed for help, but the walls of the abandoned house absorbed her cries. Laurie and Hope, complicit in the nightmare, watched, sometimes joining in, sometimes restraining. The reasons behind this violence are tangled. At its core, it was a tragic explosion of teenage jealousy, insecurity, and emotional turmoil gone horribly wrong. But the details are chilling. The premeditation, the calculated cruelty, and the way 4 young girls turned against one innocent child. When it was over, Shanda's life was lost, but the story did not end there. In the weeks that followed, the community struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could such horror unfold in a quiet Midwestern town? How could children, barely more than kids themselves, be capable of such cruelty? The investigation uncovered disturbing letters, confessions, and a web of relationships that hinted at secrets no one wanted to admit. Melinda Lovelace would later receive a life sentence, and the other girls were sentenced to lengthy prison terms as well. Shanda's family, shattered and grieving, became advocates for victims of violence and bullying, determined to make sure their daughter's story was not forgotten. As we close this part, it's impossible not to feel the weight of tragedy mixed with questions about the darkness that can dwell even in places that seem safe. It's a reminder of the fragile line between friendship and betrayal, innocence and evil. Tomorrow, we will delve deeper into the chilling details of the crime and its aftermath, exploring the investigation and the community's struggle to heal. In the days following the discovery of Shanda Sherer's body, the town of New Albany, Indiana, was gripped by shock and sorrow. News spread quickly, and the community struggled to reconcile the horror with the quiet streets and familiar faces they thought they knew. The investigation that followed would uncover a disturbing web of relationships, secrets and motives that shocked even seasoned detectives. When the police first arrived at the abandoned house where Shanda's body was found, the scene was harrowing. The walls, once silent witnesses, now held the echoes of violence. Forensics teams combed through every inch, gathering evidence to piece together the timeline of what had transpired in those final hours. Interviews with the suspects, Melinda Lovelace, Laurie Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Amanda Heverin, revealed a tangled network of emotions. Jealousy and obsession played a significant role. Melinda, in particular, had been deeply jealous of Shanda's relationship with Amanda, whom she had once considered a close friend. Court documents revealed disturbing details, Melinda's letters expressing rage and plans to harm Shanda, the group's discussions about confrontation, and the chilling preparation that led to the brutal attack. It was a case of teenage violence fueled by intense emotions, manipulation, and a desperate need for control. The trial was a media sensation. The courtroom became a stage for a tragedy that no one wanted to fully understand, but couldn't look away from. Witnesses testified about the girls' behavior leading up to the crime, the violent acts themselves, and the aftermath. Psychologists weighed in on the girls' mental states, trying to explain how young teenagers could commit such a horrific act. Melinda Lovelace was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The others received long prison terms as well, though their sentences varied based on their involvement and cooperation. Throughout the trial, Shanda's family showed remarkable courage. They spoke publicly about their daughter's life, her dreams, and the devastating loss they had endured. They became advocates for anti-bullying and violence prevention programs, hoping to prevent other families from suffering similar heartbreak. But the case also raised difficult questions. What could have been done to prevent this? Were there signs that were missed? Could the tragedy have been avoided if the girls had received better support or intervention? Shanda's story is more than just a true crime headline. It is a sobering reminder of the consequences of unchecked emotions, the dangers of peer pressure, and the tragic outcomes that can arise when pain turns to violence. As we continue, we will explore the aftermath of the crime, how the community healed, the lives affected, and the ongoing impact Shanda's story has on awareness around youth violence. The aftermath of Shanda Sherer's murder left a lasting scar on the community of New Albany and beyond. While the trial brought some measure of justice, the ripple effects of the tragedy reached far deeper than the courtroom walls. Families, schools, and counselors began to face the harsh realities of adolescent violence and the need for intervention before feelings escalate into irreversible actions. In the years following the case,
Shanda's family dedicated themselves to turning their pain into purpose. They started speaking at schools and public forums about bullying, mental health, and the importance of recognizing warning signs early. Their advocacy helped bring national attention to the issues of teen violence and the psychological struggles that many youths face. The community itself underwent a period of reflection. New Albany schools implemented new programs aimed at addressing bullying and teaching empathy. Counselors and social workers worked harder to reach students at risk, hoping to prevent future tragedies, but the healing process was slow and complicated. The families of the perpetrators also dealt with their own grief and guilt, living with the consequences of actions that could never be undone. Rehabilitation efforts, counseling and therapy became an integral part of the story, as the justice system sought not only to punish but to understand. The media coverage surrounding the case also sparked discussions on how society views violent crimes involving teenagers, particularly young women. Shanda's murder challenged stereotypes and forced conversations about gender, aggression, and the sometimes overlooked potential for violence among girls. Today, Shanda Sherer's story remains a solemn reminder of the fragility of youth and the devastating outcomes when emotions spiral out of control. It stands as a call for vigilance, compassion, and proactive support for young people navigating complex social and emotional landscapes. The legacy of this case is not just in the horror it revealed, but in the awareness it fostered. It teaches us that behind every true crime story, there are human lives forever changed, and a collective responsibility to strive for understanding and prevention. As we close this chapter, we reflect on the importance of listening, intervening, and fostering kindness in communities. Shanda Sherer's memory endures, urging us to look beyond headlines and see the urgent need for connection and care.
Story 3, The Boy in the Box, Philadelphia, 1957. In the cold early days of February 1957, a grim discovery in a quiet Philadelphia neighborhood would shock the nation and spark one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. The story of the boy in the box, a young nameless child found lifeless in a cardboard box, is a tale marked by sorrow, mystery, and a relentless search for answers that continues even decades later. On February 25, 1957, a man out collecting scrap metal near the Fox Chase area of northeast Philadelphia made a horrifying find. In a wooded area beside the railroad tracks, tucked beneath a pile of old blankets, lay the body of a small boy, no older than 4 or 5 years. The child was naked, bruised, and emaciated. His fragile form was stuffed inside a battered cardboard box, roughly the size of a large suitcase. The man immediately called the police, and an investigation was launched that would grip the nation with a mix of heartbreak and curiosity. Who was this boy? How had he come to be abandoned in such a cold, cruel way? And most haunting of all, who was responsible? When authorities first arrived, they found very little to go on. The boy had no identification, no clothes, no belongings. He was estimated to be between 3 and 7 years old, with a fragile frame that suggested he had suffered severe neglect. His hair was blonde, and his face bore bruises and scars that told a silent story of abuse. But despite the physical evidence, the boy's identity remained a complete mystery. The police quickly launched a citywide search for anyone who might recognize the child. They plastered his image on missing person posters and appealed to the public for information. Yet, even with widespread media attention, no one came forward with a name or any clues. The boy was nicknamed America's Unknown Child, a haunting label that underscored the tragedy of his anonymity. The nation mourned for a life lost too soon, but the questions only multiplied. The case was not just a murder investigation, it was a desperate attempt to find answers to a riddle no one could solve. Who was the boy? Why had he been left to die alone in the cold? And was there someone out there who knew the truth, but had kept silent? In the weeks that followed, investigators scoured the neighborhood for witnesses. They interviewed local residents, searched nearby homes, and tried to piece together any hint of the boy's origin. Some people reported hearing a crying child in the days leading up to the discovery, while others mentioned suspicious strangers. But none of these leads panned out. The autopsy revealed a heartbreaking truth. The boy had suffered physical abuse over a prolonged period and died from severe injuries consistent with blunt trauma. It was clear he had endured unimaginable suffering in the weeks before his death. But the identity of his parents, or whether he had any, remained an unsolved mystery. Was he a runaway, an abandoned child, or worse, the victim of a horrific crime committed by someone who should have protected him? Over the years, various theories emerged. Some speculated that the boy was the child of a wealthy family trying to hide a scandal. Others suggested he was a victim of human trafficking or neglect. There were even rumors of a cover-up, with whispers of powerful people wanting the case buried. Despite countless leads, tips, and renewed investigations, the mystery persisted. Advances in forensic science and DNA testing were eventually applied in hopes of cracking the case, but even with modern technology, the boy's identity remains unknown. The boy in the box case has become more than just a cold case. It is a symbol of lost innocence and a haunting reminder of the importance of child protection and social awareness. Communities remember him not only as a nameless victim, but as a call to action. His story pushes us to look out for the vulnerable, to listen for the unheard, and to act when something feels wrong. As we reflect on this tragic case, it reminds us that behind every headline, there is a human story, a life that mattered, a tragedy that changed lives, and a mystery that still waits for answers. In the weeks following the grim discovery of the boy in the cardboard box, the investigation deepened, yet answers remained frustratingly out of reach. Police worked tirelessly, reaching out to hospitals, orphanages, and social services, hoping to find a match for the boy's description. Still, no missing child report fit. The Philadelphia Police Department assembled a task force dedicated to the case. They meticulously combed through records of missing children from across the country. Every lead was followed up, every tip was taken seriously. Yet the boy's identity stayed elusive. In an effort to help the public connect with the unknown child, the police commissioned a series of forensic sketches depicting the boy's face. Artists worked from autopsy photos and descriptions to create lifelike portraits that would be distributed nationwide. These images appeared in newspapers, on posters, and on the evening news, yet no one stepped forward. One particularly heartbreaking development came from a woman who believed the boy might be her grandson, missing since a family tragedy years earlier. She provided photographs and DNA samples to authorities, but testing eventually ruled out a connection. There were several similar stories, each ending in disappointment. At the time, forensic science was limited, and many of the tools investigators rely on today simply did not exist. DNA analysis was decades away from being a practical investigative method. As a result, leads often went cold, victims remained nameless, and cases like this grew colder by the day. The media dubbed the boy in the box, and his story captured the imagination of the nation. People were drawn to the mystery. Why had no one reported him missing? Why had he been treated so cruelly? And most chillingly, who could have done such a thing without leaving a trace? The neighborhood where the body was found was quiet and unassuming. Residents expressed shock and sorrow, but could offer little information. The woods and abandoned rail yards, where the boy was discovered, had seen transient populations, and were sometimes frequented by vagrants, but no definitive suspects emerged from this angle. As the investigation unfolded, one particularly haunting theory gained attention. Some believed the boy was deliberately hidden in the box by his killer, as a way of hiding the crime in plain sight. The location was remote enough that the body could go unnoticed for days, but close enough to a suburban area to complicate the search. Despite extensive efforts, the case began to fade from the headlines as newer tragedies captured public attention. But for the police and a small group of dedicated volunteers and cold case enthusiasts, the search for answers never stopped. In the decades that followed, the boy in the box became a symbol in missing persons and child welfare circles. His tragic story inspired calls for improved child protection laws, better reporting systems, and more coordinated national databases for missing children. The case also highlighted the limits of forensic science and the desperate need for advances. With no clear leads, investigators hoped that someday, new technology could shed light on the mystery. Then in the late 20th century, as DNA testing revolutionized criminal investigations, the case was reopened with renewed hope. Samples taken from the boy's remains were tested against national DNA databases in search of a familial match. Despite some promising leads, none resulted in identifying the boy or his family. The mystery persisted, leaving a somber reminder that some victims, no matter how much effort is put in, remain without names. Community memorials sprung up to honor the boy's memory. A small headstone was placed at the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's office, where the boy was autopsied, marking a place for reflection. Annual vigils are held by advocacy groups, remembering him and others like him, children who suffered in silence. The boy in the box case is also a reminder of the power and limits of media in true crime stories. Public interest kept the case alive, but at times sensationalism complicated investigations and caused pain for families searching for missing children. Still, the enduring fascination with the case reveals a collective yearning to provide justice and closure. The boy's story is a plea to society, to protect the vulnerable, to question when something seems wrong, and to never stop seeking answers. In the next part, we'll explore some of the most intriguing theories, suspects, and new developments in this chilling mystery that has captivated generations. As the years passed, many theories emerged about who the boy in the box might have been, and who could have been responsible for his death. The case attracted a wide array of suspects, ranging from family members to strangers, and even some darker possibilities that chilled investigators and the public alike. One of the earliest theories focused on the boy being an illegitimate child, perhaps abandoned or hidden by relatives fearful of scandal. At the time, social stigma around such situations was intense, and it was not uncommon for children born out of wedlock to be kept secret. Some suspected that the boy might have been deliberately concealed to hide family secrets. However, no concrete evidence emerged to support this. Other investigators explored the possibility that the boy was a victim of abuse within the foster care system or an orphanage. There were reports of missing children from nearby institutions during the same period, though none matched the boy's description exactly. The lack of identification made it impossible to confirm any links. Attention also turned toward transient or criminal elements who might have harmed the boy. The area where the body was found had seen reports of vagrants and petty criminals. Yet no clear suspects or motives came to light from these lines of inquiry. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case was the absence of witnesses or any sign of the killer. No footprints, no fingerprints, no belongings. The boy was found naked, suggesting extreme neglect or an attempt to prevent identification. Investigators struggled to piece together a timeline, with only the decomposition and insect activity providing rough estimates of the time of death. In the decades following the discovery, amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts kept the case alive. Several attempted to analyze the old evidence with new technology, and some even created facial reconstructions using computer graphics to show how the boy might have looked alive. These efforts rekindled hope that someone might recognize him. One notable breakthrough came in the form of a partial DNA profile extracted from the remains. Advances in genetic genealogy offered a potential path forward by comparing this DNA to databases used for ancestry and familial matching. This technique had solved cold cases before, notably the identification of the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes. However, the boy in the box case proved more difficult. The DNA results led to some distant relatives, but no immediate family members came forward. The trail was cold again. The mystery deepened when some researchers suggested the boy may have been a victim of a family involved in illegal activities. In some theories, the child was the casualty of a dark secret hidden by a powerful local family, which could explain the lack of reports and the silence from neighbors. Despite the many theories, no confession or arrest ever came. The case remains officially unsolved, a haunting enigma in Philadelphia's history. The boy in the box symbolizes not only a tragic death, but the failures of the social systems meant to protect children. It reminds us that behind every cold case is a human life, lost, silenced, and waiting for justice. In the final part,
We will explore the ongoing efforts to solve this decades-old mystery, and the hope that modern science might finally give the boy his name and story back. In recent years, the case of the boy in the box has seen renewed interest, thanks to modern forensic science and the dedication of cold case investigators. Advances in DNA technology, particularly genetic genealogy, have offered new hope for solving cases that seemed permanently sealed by time. In 2019, Philadelphia police announced that they had extracted a DNA sample from the boy's remains and submitted it to a genealogy database. The goal was to find living relatives by tracing common ancestors and building family trees, a technique that had cracked several decades-old mysteries before. Volunteers and genealogists combed through millions of records, searching for connections that might identify the boy. Slowly, distant relatives were uncovered, and some family branches traced back to the Philadelphia area during the 1950s. Despite the progress, identifying the boy's parents or guardians remained elusive. The DNA matches were distant, and there were no immediate family members in available databases. Privacy laws and incomplete records created barriers, but investigators did not give up. Meanwhile, the public's fascination with the case continued to fuel support. Documentaries, podcasts, and books revisited the story, sparking discussions and encouraging anyone with information to come forward. Social media campaigns also helped keep the boy's memory alive, emphasizing the importance of justice and remembrance. One heartbreaking aspect of the case is imagining the boy's final moments and the life he never got to live. Without a name, he is forever known as America's unknown child, or simply the boy in the box, a symbol of innocence lost and the many children whose stories remain untold. The mystery also raised questions about the social conditions of the era, poverty, neglect, and systemic failures that allowed such tragedies to happen. It pushed communities to rethink child protection laws and inspired reforms to ensure better safety and support for vulnerable children. For families living with missing loved ones, the boy in the box case serves as a solemn reminder of the importance of hope and perseverance. The possibility that one day the boy's true identity might be uncovered gives comfort to many. While the boy's name remains a mystery for now, his story continues to resonate. The search for truth transcends decades, driven by compassion and the unyielding desire for justice. As we close this chapter, we remember the boy in the box not just as a cold case file, but as a young life whose silence calls out for answers, answers that may yet come with time, technology, and human determination.
In the quiet early hours of August 9, 2013, Brandon Lawson's life took a sudden, alarming turn, one that would baffle investigators and haunt the Texas Hill Country for years to come. What began as a routine trip home from work quickly spiraled into a harrowing mystery filled with strange phone calls, desperate pleas for help, and a disappearance that defied explanation. Brandon Lawson was a 26-year-old family man living in San Angelo, Texas. Known as a hard-working and caring father, Brandon had faced his share of struggles, particularly with substance abuse, but was trying to rebuild his life and be there for his children. That summer evening, Brandon was driving home from a job at a nearby oil field when something went terribly wrong. His troubles began on a lonely stretch of Highway 277, about 15 miles outside the small town of Bronte. Witnesses later described seeing a truck swerving erratically, weaving in and out of lanes, and almost running off the road. A passing motorist stopped to offer help, but Brandon declined, saying he was fine. Minutes later, he was on the phone with his brother, pleading for help, sounding terrified. The sequence of events that unfolded over the next few hours is recorded through frantic 911 calls, desperate conversations, and confusing messages, all of which have been pieced together to form a chilling picture of Brandon's last known moments. At 10:17 p.m., Brandon called his brother, saying he was in trouble and needed someone to come get him. His voice was panicked and his words fragmented. His brother immediately tried to find him, but Brandon's location was unclear. Multiple 911 calls followed, some from Brandon's phone and others from concerned witnesses who saw his truck abandoned on the side of the road. One of the most disturbing parts of the story is the series of voice messages Brandon left, captured on his brother's phone. In them, Brandon sounds disoriented and terrified, mentioning that someone was chasing him or trying to harm him. His breathing is heavy, and the background noise suggests he was outside, possibly in the dense brush along the highway. Despite extensive searches by law enforcement, volunteers and family members, no trace of Brandon Lawson was ever found. His truck was discovered with the keys inside, the engine still warm, but there was no sign of Brandon himself. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Theories about Brandon's disappearance range widely, from an accident in the rugged terrain, to an encounter with wild animals, to something far more sinister, involving foul play. Some speculate that Brandon may have suffered a medical emergency or become disoriented due to intoxication, while others believe he was the victim of a criminal act. The case drew significant media attention, sparking public fascination and ongoing efforts to uncover what really happened that night. Families, search teams, and even psychics became involved, each adding pieces to the puzzle but failing to solve the mystery. One haunting detail in the story is the mysterious red truck seen near the area around the time Brandon disappeared, which some believe may have been involved. However, no definitive link has ever been made. Brandon Lawson's disappearance remains one of Texas's most baffling missing person cases, marked by unanswered questions and a chilling sense of unfinished business. His family continues to hold on to hope, while the public remains captivated by the strange and tragic circumstances surrounding his vanishing. The hours following Brandon Lawson's disappearance were a blur of frantic searching, confusion, and growing fear. As news of the missing man spread through San Angelo and the surrounding communities, volunteers gathered and law enforcement mobilized, desperately trying to piece together the fragmented clues left behind. When Brandon's brother, Mark Lawson, first received those frantic calls, he immediately realized something was very wrong. The panic in Brandon's voice was unlike anything he had ever heard before. "I'm in trouble," Brandon had said, but when pressed for details, his words were scattered and incoherent. Mark quickly called 911 and gave the dispatcher what little information he had. Brandon's last known location on Highway 277, the time of the call, and his truck's description. Law enforcement officers arrived at the scene where Brandon's truck was found abandoned on the side of the highway, just north of Bronte. The truck was parked unusually, with the driver's door wide open, engine running, and the keys left inside. It was as if Brandon had simply stepped out, intending to return quickly. Yet no one saw him leave, and no one had heard from him since those desperate phone calls. Investigators began searching the area extensively, combing the roadside, nearby woods, and the harsh, rugged terrain. The landscape in that part of Texas is unforgiving: thick brush, uneven ground, and a sprawling wilderness that can quickly swallow a person. Despite the massive search efforts involving police, search and rescue teams, and community volunteers, no trace of Brandon was found. This lack of physical evidence only deepened the mystery. One of the first puzzles investigators faced was the content and tone of Brandon's calls and voice messages. Law enforcement obtained recordings of the calls made from Brandon's phone to his brother and 911. In these recordings, Brandon's voice is panicked, breathless, and at times almost incoherent. He mentioned multiple times that someone was chasing him, or that he was hiding from a person who wanted to hurt him. But who was this person? Was Brandon being stalked, or was he suffering from a state of confusion or paranoia, brought on by stress, intoxication, or a medical condition? The truth remained elusive. Adding to the complexity were reports from local residents who claimed to have seen a red truck circling the area multiple times that night. Some speculated this vehicle could have been involved in Brandon's disappearance. The descriptions of the driver were vague, but the red truck became a significant thread in the investigation. Despite numerous tips and leads, police were never able to identify or locate this mysterious vehicle or its driver. Further complicating the case was Brandon's personal history. He was known to have struggled with substance abuse in the past. Some believed that Brandon may have relapsed and become impaired, leading to an accident or poor decision-making that left him vulnerable. Others felt that Brandon's calls suggested something far more sinister. A few days after Brandon vanished, his family and police released a statement asking for the public's help in locating him. The case quickly gained national attention, sparking widespread interest and concern. Social media campaigns, news reports, and community efforts sought to keep Brandon's story alive and gather any information that could solve the mystery. Despite these efforts, the trail went cold. Months passed, and the hope of finding Brandon alive began to fade, but the mystery only deepened. Several unofficial theories began circulating. Some believed Brandon had simply gotten lost in the wilderness and succumbed to the elements. The Texas Hill Country's harsh conditions can be deadly, especially for someone disoriented or injured. Yet no body or remains were ever found, which would be expected if that were the case. Others thought Brandon had been abducted or harmed by someone intentionally. The references to being chased in his calls fueled these fears, but no suspect was ever identified, and there was no physical evidence pointing to foul play. There were also darker speculations involving criminal activity, drug-related conflicts, or even a sudden mental health crisis, leading to Brandon disappearing intentionally or accidentally. One haunting detail from the investigation was the timeline of Brandon's last known movements. According to phone records, Brandon made a call to his brother at approximately 10:17 p.m., asking for help. Between that call and the time his truck was found, around 11 p.m., there were several other attempts by Brandon to communicate, including calls to 911 dispatchers. In one 911 call, Brandon spoke in a whisper, barely audible, mentioning he was hiding but not giving specifics. The 911 operators described the calls as confusing, with Brandon sounding both scared and desperate, but unable to clearly explain his situation or location. These calls would become key evidence, but also a source of frustration. Despite the urgency, rescuers struggled to pinpoint where Brandon was, or what exactly had happened to him. Adding to the eerie nature of the case, no clear motive or enemy ever surfaced. Brandon was not known to have any enemies, or ongoing threats that could explain the chilling phone calls about being chased. This raised the question, was Brandon's fear a product of a real threat, or was it a manifestation of psychological distress? Friends and family noted that Brandon was trying to rebuild his life. He had been attending meetings and working to stay clean, but the past was never far behind. Some wondered if old demons or personal struggles had finally caught up with him in a moment of vulnerability. Law enforcement continued their investigation, following every lead, interviewing friends, family, and acquaintances. They canvassed the area for months, conducting searches in harsh weather and difficult terrain. Yet no evidence was uncovered. One theory that gained traction was that Brandon might have accidentally injured himself and become incapacitated somewhere in the wilderness, unable to call for help again or move. Search dogs were brought in, but no scent was picked up beyond a small radius near his truck. The harsh environment of West Texas is unforgiving. Summer temperatures can be brutal during the day, but nights may be cold. Wildlife in the area includes coyotes and snakes, adding to the danger. A person stranded in the brush, especially if injured or impaired, could quickly succumb to the elements. As days turned to weeks, public interest waned, but Brandon's family never gave up hope. They organized multiple private searches, distributed flyers, and appeared on local media. Mark Lawson, Brandon's brother, often spoke to the press, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Despite these efforts, the case went cold. In the years that followed, Brandon Lawson's disappearance remained a haunting reminder of how quickly a normal night can turn into a nightmare. The mystery of what happened to him on that lonely stretch of Highway 277 continues to puzzle law enforcement, true crime enthusiasts, and the community. For some, the unanswered questions fuel a sense of fear and fascination. What really happened that night? Was Brandon running from a real danger, or a figment of his own mind? Did he fall victim to someone unknown, or did the unforgiving wilderness claim him quietly? No matter the theory, one thing is clear: Brandon Lawson's story is a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of everyday existence. As the investigation dragged on with no new leads, the focus began to shift toward the small clues Brandon had left behind. Law enforcement pored over every piece of evidence from that night, scrutinizing the truck, the phone records, and witness statements in painstaking detail. But it was the mysterious phone calls that kept haunting everyone involved. One of the most chilling moments came when investigators played the recordings of Brandon's 911 calls for the public. Listeners could hear the trembling in his voice, the halting words, the pauses where he struggled to breathe or compose himself. At times he seemed to whisper urgently, almost as if fearing that someone nearby might hear him. In one call, Brandon says something almost inaudible but disturbing, "Please don't let him find me." In another, he talks about the man and the lights. These vague references sparked a wave of speculation. Who was this him? What were the lights Brandon was afraid of? Was Brandon simply disoriented, or was he truly being pursued? Psychologists and experts who later analyzed the calls suggested several possibilities. One was that Brandon might have been experiencing paranoia or hallucinations, possibly related to substance use or a mental health episode. Another theory was that Brandon's fear was real, that someone was indeed after him that night, but had managed to stay hidden. Adding to the puzzle was the physical condition of Brandon's truck when it was found. Police noted that the truck was parked on the shoulder, not far from the highway, but the door was left wide open. The engine was still running, and inside, investigators found some of Brandon's personal belongings scattered, his wallet, phone, and some keys. But there was no sign of a struggle inside the vehicle, and no apparent damage to the truck or signs that anyone else had been there. This led some to wonder whether Brandon had exited the vehicle willingly, or was forced out in a hurry. The roadside terrain itself was rough. The area where the truck was found is bordered by dense brush and uneven ground. It's a place where someone could disappear easily, especially at night. Search dogs were brought to the scene, but failed to pick up an extended scent trail. Investigators speculated that the scent might have been lost due to weather conditions, or because Brandon had moved quickly, or been carried elsewhere. Local residents told police about strange sightings in the days leading up to Brandon's disappearance. Some recalled seeing a red pickup truck driving erratically near the highway, the same vehicle others had reported during the initial investigation. However, no one could identify the driver or give a license plate. Theories about what happened that night varied widely. Some suggested Brandon had run into someone dangerous, perhaps a criminal or stranger with violent intent. The references to the man in his calls seemed to support this idea. But if that was the case, why had no suspects emerged? And why had no other crimes been reported in the area? Others believed Brandon's fear was a product of his own mind. Substance use or withdrawal can trigger severe anxiety, confusion and hallucinations. Some experts thought Brandon might have become disoriented, fled his truck in panic, and then wandered off into the wilderness, unable to find his way back. This theory was supported by the fact that Brandon had struggled with addiction in the past. Though he was reportedly trying to get clean, relapse is common and can bring dangerous consequences. Still, there was no concrete evidence that Brandon was under the influence that night, and no drugs or paraphernalia were found in his vehicle. Family members leaned heavily toward the theory of foul play. Mark Lawson insisted that Brandon's disappearance was not random. He believed that someone had targeted his brother, and that the red truck was connected to the case. The family's pleas for more thorough investigations and renewed search efforts went largely unanswered. As months passed, public interest in the case began to fade, but the mystery continued to grip true crime communities and online forums. Amateur sleuths pored over every detail, combing through timelines, geographic data, and phone records, hoping to find a breakthrough. One of the most puzzling aspects was the fact that Brandon's phone continued to make calls long after he was last seen. Investigators discovered that multiple calls were made from his phone in the hours following the initial 911 call. Some of these calls were to family members, others to unknown numbers. In some of these later calls, Brandon's voice sounded calmer, almost resigned. He spoke cryptically about being lost and trying to stay safe. He also mentioned that help was coming but never gave specifics. The timing and location of these calls suggest Brandon might have been moving on foot through the area, trying to find shelter or a way back to safety. Law enforcement theorized that Brandon could have been trying to get out of the woods or find a road. But with the heavy brush and darkness, it's possible he became disoriented. Adding to the complexity was the fact that the search area itself was enormous. The Texas Hill Country and surrounding regions cover vast swaths of rugged land,
with many remote spots difficult to access. Even today, years later, volunteers and family members occasionally conduct private searches, hoping to uncover some trace of Brandon. A small but haunting detail is that Brandon's dog, named Buddy, was never found. Some suggested the dog might have been with Brandon during his disappearance, but no evidence supports this theory. Over time, the mystery took on a life of its own, inspiring podcasts, documentaries, and countless online discussions. People around the world speculated about what might have happened, but no definitive answers emerged. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in missing persons investigations, especially when dealing with adults who might have complicated personal histories. One heartbreaking aspect was the toll on Brandon's family. The uncertainty and absence took a heavy emotional and psychological toll. With no closure for years, the community in San Angelo held vigils and fundraisers, hoping to keep Brandon's story alive. His brother Mark became an advocate for missing persons cases, speaking openly about the pain and frustration of searching for a loved one who vanished without a trace. In the end, the disappearance of Brandon Lawson remains one of the most baffling missing person cases of the 21st century. Was Brandon running from a real threat, a figment of his own fears, or something else entirely? Did he succumb to the wilderness, or was he taken by a stranger? The truth may never be known, but the story stands as a chilling reminder of how quickly life can change, how easily someone can vanish in the modern world, and how unanswered questions can haunt a family forever. The weeks turned into months, and the search for Brandon Lawson grew colder, yet his family's hope never waned. The mystery surrounding his disappearance became a dark shadow that stretched far beyond San Angelo, Texas, capturing the attention of the national media, true crime enthusiasts, and anyone drawn to the unsettling unknown. As the official search efforts wound down, Brandon's loved ones took matters into their own hands, conducting private searches and working with volunteers to scour the rugged Texas hill country. The terrain was unforgiving. Thick brush, rocky outcrops, and steep ravines concealed countless hiding places where a person could easily become lost or worse. Brandon's brother Mark, in particular, became the driving force behind these ongoing efforts. He refused to accept that Brandon had simply vanished into thin air. Mark pored over maps, studied satellite images, and followed up on every tip, no matter how small or improbable. He even sought the help of psychics and private investigators, hoping for a breakthrough. One of the more promising leads came months after Brandon's disappearance, when a hiker reported seeing a man matching Brandon's description near a remote creek far from the highway. However, despite an intensive search of the area, no evidence was found. The sighting remained unconfirmed, but it fueled the hope that Brandon might still be alive. Meanwhile, the phone records and 911 calls were analyzed in more detail by telecommunications experts. The patterns were puzzling. The phone appeared to move in an erratic path, back and forth along roads and then into undeveloped land, as if Brandon was trying to evade someone or something. Some experts speculated that Brandon might have been hiding, perhaps scared of pursuers. The frantic tone of his calls supported this, as did his references to the man and the lights. The possibility that Brandon was a victim of a stalker or assailant lingered. Others pointed to the possibility of a tragic accident. The rugged, often foggy terrain of the hill country is treacherous, and several past incidents had involved hikers and hunters who got lost and perished in the wilderness. If Brandon had injured himself, fallen, or been overcome by exposure, it could explain why no trace of him was found. One theory proposed that Brandon might have sought shelter in an abandoned building or cave. The Texas hill country is dotted with old homesteads, hunting cabins, and natural caves that could provide refuge or entrapment. In addition to the physical search, law enforcement followed up on the red pickup truck sightings. Witnesses had described the truck as driving erratically near the scene on the night of Brandon's disappearance, and Mark Lawson believed this vehicle was key to solving the case. Unfortunately, no registration or ownership records matched the descriptions, and the driver remained unidentified. Some speculated that the truck could have belonged to a local with a history of violence or substance abuse, but police were unable to find any direct links. As the years passed, the case grew cold from an official standpoint, but remained warm in the hearts of Brandon's family and friends. They held annual vigils on the anniversary of his disappearance, lighting candles along the highway where his truck was found. At these gatherings, they shared stories, memories, and the hope that one day Brandon might be found alive, or at least that his fate would be uncovered. Brandon's story also raised broader questions about the nature of missing persons cases, especially those involving adults. Unlike cases involving children or suspicious circumstances, adult disappearances often receive less media coverage and fewer resources. Some advocates argued that the stigma surrounding addiction and mental health issues sometimes leads to less urgency in investigations. In Brandon's case, his past struggles may have complicated the narrative and public perception, even though his family emphasized that he was a loving brother and son who deserved answers. The emotional toll on the family was immense. Mark spoke openly about the guilt, frustration and heartbreak that came with not knowing whether Brandon was suffering, hiding or worse. He also talked about the challenge of living in limbo, unable to grieve properly without closure, but unable to give up hope. In 2015, 2 years after Brandon's disappearance, a new twist emerged. A man came forward, claiming to have information about what happened that night. He said he had seen Brandon in a nearby town a few days after the disappearance, looking disoriented and scared. The man claimed Brandon had asked for help, but disappeared before he could be assisted. Police investigated, but could neither confirm nor deny the claim. The tip was tantalizing, but ultimately inconclusive. Then in 2016, Brandon's phone was briefly detected connecting to a cell tower miles from the disappearance site. This suggested that Brandon, or someone using his phone, might have been alive and moving for some time after the last known calls. However, the signal was weak, and no further connections were detected. In the years that followed, new technology offered some hope. Advances in DNA analysis, facial recognition, and missing persons databases created opportunities to cross-check unidentified remains and suspicious sightings. Brandon's family submitted DNA samples to national databases, hoping to match with unidentified bodies or relatives. Despite these efforts, no definitive match was made. Brandon Lawson's disappearance became part of a larger conversation about the vulnerabilities faced by people living in rural areas, especially those dealing with addiction, mental health issues, or unstable family situations. His case highlighted the dangers of isolation and the challenges of finding help when needed. It also raised awareness about the importance of community vigilance and the need for better resources for missing persons investigations in remote areas. Today, nearly a decade after Brandon vanished, the mystery remains unsolved. The questions persist. What really happened on that lonely Texas highway? Was Brandon running from a threat only he knew about? Did he survive the wilderness? Or did tragedy claim him? Or was something more sinister at play? For Brandon's family, and those who followed his story, the hope for answers continues to burn. The search may be long, the mystery deep, but the story of Brandon Lawson serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of life, and the painful uncertainty left when someone disappears without a trace.
Story 5. The Slenderman stabbings in the quiet suburb of Waukesha, Wisconsin, nestled among manicured lawns and sleepy streets. A chilling and almost surreal crime unfolded in the spring of 2014. It was a story so strange and horrifying that it shocked not only the local community but the entire nation, blending the dark corners of internet culture with a terrifying act of violence that seemed ripped from a nightmare. The story centers on two 12-year-old girls, Anissa Wire and Morgan Geyser, students at a local middle school who on the surface appeared to be typical pre-teens. But beneath that normal exterior lurked a terrifying obsession with an internet legend known as Slenderman. Slenderman, for those unfamiliar, is a fictional supernatural entity created in 2009 as part of an online creepypasta, a modern myth told through short, scary stories posted on the internet. The character is described as a tall, faceless figure in a black suit with unnaturally long arms and legs, capable of stretching or shortening his limbs at will. He was said to lurk in forests, stalking children, abducting or harming those who caught his attention. Though entirely fictional, Slenderman had taken on a life of its own in the digital world, inspiring fan art, stories, videos, and online communities dedicated to the mythos. To many, he was just a spooky internet meme, but to others, especially impressionable youths, he became something far more real and dangerously influential. Anissa and Morgan were among those captivated by the legend. They believed, or at least told themselves, that Slenderman was real. They felt drawn to him, enchanted by the idea that he existed beyond the screen, an otherworldly being who held immense power and could grant them protection or status, but only if they proved their loyalty. Their fascination wasn't just casual, it grew into an obsession. They spent countless hours online, researching Slenderman, discussing ways to find him, and planning how to become his proxies on Earth. Their shared fantasy became their secret world, an escape from the ordinary, and a dark pathway to something they didn't fully understand. The events of that spring day would shatter any illusion that this was just a harmless obsession. On a warm June afternoon in 2014, the two girls set out on a plan that would horrify their community and ripple across the globe. Their target was another 12-year-old girl from their school, Peyton Leutner, someone they knew well, someone who they believed needed to be sacrificed to Slenderman to prove their devotion. In the woods near Waukesha, the girls lured Peyton with promises of a sleepover, or simply caught her off guard during their walk home from school. The secluded woods, thick with trees and shadows, would become the scene of a brutal attack that few could have predicted. Armed with a kitchen knife Anissa had taken from home, the girls ambushed Peyton. The attack was vicious and chilling. Peyton was stabbed multiple times, 19 times in total, suffering wounds to her back, torso, and arms. Remarkably, despite the severity of her injuries, Peyton survived. She managed to crawl away from the attack site, flagging down a nearby bicyclist who called for emergency help. As paramedics rushed Peyton to the hospital, the police began piecing together what had happened. The investigation quickly revealed the disturbing truth. Anissa and Morgan had committed the stabbing not out of anger or jealousy, but because they believed Slenderman had instructed them to do so. They wanted to please him, to gain his favor and protection. Slenderman was no longer just a myth or a game. In their minds he was a terrifying and real force demanding obedience. The case sent shockwaves through Waukesha and beyond. It raised urgent questions about the influence of internet culture on youth, the blurred lines between fantasy and reality, and the warning signs parents, teachers, and communities might miss. How could two children so young plan and carry out such a violent act with such cold determination? How deeply had they been influenced by a fictional character born online? The courtroom saga that followed was as complex and unsettling as the crime itself. Psychologists, internet experts, and legal teams debated fiercely over the girls' mental state, their understanding of right and wrong, and the impact of their Slenderman obsession. Both Anissa and Morgan were eventually charged with attempted first-degree intentional homicide. However, their defense teams argued that the girls were suffering from psychotic delusions, driven by a belief in Slenderman's existence, and thus lacked the ability to fully comprehend their actions. In 2017, Morgan Geyser accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 40 years in a mental health institution. Anissa Wire pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced to 25 years in a mental health facility. The sentences reflected the court's recognition of their age, mental health issues, and the unique nature of the crime. The Slenderman stabbing case sparked a nationwide discussion about the dangers of internet myths, the importance of mental health awareness, and how parents and educators could better protect children from harmful online influences. It also highlighted the disturbing potential for digital folklore to cross into real life, especially when mixed with young minds vulnerable to suggestion, fantasy, and confusion about the boundaries of reality. Yet, behind the headlines and the court rulings, the human story remained deeply tragic. Peyton Leutner survived, but endured lasting physical and emotional scars. Anissa and Morgan, once friends bound by a shared fascination, were forever changed by the night their fantasy turned into violence. The Slenderman stabbing wasn't just a crime story, it was a cautionary tale about the power of myths in the digital age, and a stark reminder that sometimes the darkest monsters aren't the ones lurking in the shadows, but the ones created by our own fears and imaginations. The days following the attack on Peyton Leutner brought a mix of shock, sorrow and bewilderment to the small community of Waukesha, Wisconsin. No one could quite grasp how something so dark and violent could erupt from what seemed like ordinary preteens, living ordinary lives. To understand what happened, it became essential to peer deeper into the lives of Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser, the girls behind the attack, and to explore how an eerie internet myth like Slenderman had woven itself into their reality so tightly that it led to nearly fatal consequences. Anissa and Morgan were both 12 years old at the time of the stabbing. They had been friends for several years, classmates and neighbors who shared many of the typical interests of children their age: music, movies, and crucially, time spent online. Like many kids growing up in the early 2010s, they were digital natives, fluent in social media and internet subcultures. But their particular fascination with Slenderman went beyond the usual curiosity or casual enjoyment of a scary story. Slenderman was born in 2009 as a creepypasta, a type of short horror fiction spread across internet forums, message boards and social media. The character was created as a modern urban legend, a faceless entity with an unnerving presence, often depicted in black suit and tie, capable of stretching limbs and controlling minds. In the creepypasta stories, Slenderman was often said to stalk children, abduct them, or cause madness and death. For many, Slenderman was simply a chilling story, a game to be shared among friends around a campfire or online. But for Anissa and Morgan, the legend became something dangerously real. They began spending extensive time on forums like Something Awful and other online communities where Slenderman fan content flourished. They watched videos, read stories, and became immersed in the mythology, which grew darker and more elaborate with each iteration. As they dove deeper into the legend, the lines between reality and fiction started to blur. The girls talked about Slenderman as if he were a real entity watching them, a powerful being who demanded obedience and loyalty. They believed that by committing acts on his behalf, they could become his proxies, his human agents on Earth, granted protection from harm and elevated status in return. This belief formed the core of what would become the plan to attack Peyton Leutner. Their idea was chilling in its logic. They thought that to prove their devotion and loyalty, they needed to sacrifice a classmate to Slenderman. Peyton was chosen not because of any personal grudge or malice, but because she was part of their social circle and someone they could lure into the woods. This was not a random attack. It was planned and premeditated, fueled by delusion and fear. In the days before the stabbing, Anissa and Morgan communicated frequently about their plans. Anissa took a kitchen knife from her home, hiding it in her backpack. The two girls talked about how the attack would be the ultimate proof that Slenderman existed, and that they were his true followers. They expected that after the attack, Slenderman would reward them by sparing their families and granting them supernatural protection. When the day came, the girls led Peyton to a secluded area in the woods near their neighborhood. They ambushed her and stabbed her 19 times, inflicting wounds to her back and torso. Despite the brutality, Peyton's strength and determination to survive saved her life. She managed to drag herself away and flag down a cyclist, who called emergency services. The police arrived quickly, and their investigation unfolded in a way that would shock even the most hardened detectives. Anissa and Morgan were taken into custody and immediately questioned. From the start, it was clear that this was not a typical juvenile crime. The girls confessed to the attack and spoke openly about Slenderman, describing their belief that he was real and had commanded them to carry out the stabbing. Their testimonies were chilling and difficult to comprehend for adults who struggled to understand how such young children could be drawn into such a dark fantasy with such conviction. The case then became a landmark legal and psychological battle, raising profound questions about mental health, the influence of the internet, and the capacity for children to commit violent crimes under the sway of delusions. One key element in the trial was the question of whether the girls understood the nature and consequences of their actions. Both defense and prosecution brought in expert witnesses, psychologists, psychiatrists, and internet culture specialists to assess the girl's mental states. Morgan Geyser was diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia, a serious mental illness characterized by hallucinations and delusions. Psychiatrists testified that Morgan genuinely believed Slenderman was a supernatural being, and that she was acting under his control. This diagnosis played a crucial role in the decision to sentence her to a mental health facility, rather than a traditional juvenile correctional institution. Anissa Weir's mental health was also scrutinized. Although she did not have a diagnosis as severe as Morgan's, she was found to have a fragile psychological state, influenced by the same obsession. Her defense argued that she too was not fully responsible for her actions due to her belief in Slenderman and the psychological pressure she felt. The prosecution, however, focused on the premeditated nature of the attack, emphasizing that the girls had planned the stabbing days in advance and taken deliberate steps to prepare for it. They argued that the girls knew the difference between right and wrong and understood the gravity of their crime. In 2017, the case was resolved with plea deals. Morgan Geyser accepted a sentence of 40 years in a mental health institution, recognizing her ongoing need for psychiatric care. Anissa Weir pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced to 25 years in a mental health facility. These sentences reflected a compromise, acknowledging both the severity of the crime and the unique mental health factors involved. Beyond the courtroom, the case sparked a nationwide conversation about the power and danger of online myths. The Slenderman stabbing highlighted the risks faced by young people exposed to graphic and immersive digital content without appropriate guidance or support. Educators, parents, and mental health professionals began to ask difficult questions. How can we recognize when children are slipping into dangerous fantasies? How can we teach critical thinking skills to help them separate fact from fiction? What role should internet platforms and communities play in moderating content that could be harmful to vulnerable users? The tragedy also shone a light on the broader issue of adolescent mental health. Early diagnosis and intervention could potentially have prevented the attack, but the stigma surrounding mental illness often keeps families and individuals from seeking help. The Slenderman case served as a painful example of what can happen when mental health problems go unrecognized and untreated, and when digital worlds become more compelling and real to young minds than the physical world around them. Meanwhile, Peyton Leutner's story remained one of survival and resilience. Despite the horrific wounds she suffered, she underwent multiple surgeries and months of therapy. Her courage and determination to recover became an inspiration to many, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, hope can endure. As for Anissa and Morgan, their lives behind the walls of mental health institutions continued under strict supervision and treatment. Their futures were uncertain, shaped by a complex blend of psychology, law, and the tragic consequences of a story that had started as a creepy internet myth. The Slenderman stabbing remains one of the most disturbing true crime cases of the 21st century. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the influence of digital culture on youth, the fragility of the human mind, and the thin, often invisible line between fantasy and reality. As society continues to navigate the digital age, the case stands as a solemn warning. In a world where myths can be created and spread at the click of a button, we must be vigilant, to protect the vulnerable, to foster critical awareness, and to ensure that the monsters we imagine never become the monsters we live. The Slenderman stabbing sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet suburban streets of Waukesha, Wisconsin. As details emerged, the story became a media sensation, part true crime, part urban legend, and part a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking in the digital age. The blend of innocence and horror, youth and violence, fantasy and reality captured the public imagination in a way few cases had before. Media sensation and public fascination. From the moment Peyton Leutner was found bleeding in the woods, the story rapidly evolved into a national and then international headline. News outlets scrambled to cover the bizarre and disturbing details. 2 12-year-old girls stabbing a friend 19 times to appease a mythical creature born on the internet. The
The media coverage was intense and relentless. Headlines emphasized the chilling influence of the Slenderman myth, often sensationalizing the story as a battle between supernatural forces and childhood innocence. Documentaries, TV specials, and countless online videos analyzed every detail, from the psychological profiles of the girls to the origins of Slenderman and the role of social media. While the coverage increased awareness, it also raised important ethical questions. The girls were minors, and their involvement in such a horrifying crime posed a dilemma about how much of their identities and personal histories should be revealed. The press often struggled to balance public interest with the need to protect the privacy and rehabilitation prospects of Anissa and Morgan. The story also opened up a broader conversation about media responsibility when reporting on juvenile crime, particularly when the offenders themselves were victims of psychological illness and societal neglect. The role of the internet and social media, a key focus of media and public discourse, was the role of the internet in shaping the events leading to the stabbing. Slenderman, after all, was an internet-born myth, and the girls' immersion in online forums, videos and communities where the story flourished was at the heart of the tragedy. Internet experts and psychologists weighed in on how digital spaces, especially those unsupervised or unmoderated, could amplify fears, spread misinformation, and blur the line between reality and fantasy for young impressionable users. Parents and educators became more concerned about how much time children were spending online, what content they were accessing, and how to monitor and guide their internet use responsibly. The idea of a faceless, sinister figure stalking kids through screens became a potent symbol of modern fears around online safety. This also prompted calls for better digital literacy education, emphasizing critical thinking, discernment, and healthy skepticism among young users to prevent them from becoming lost in harmful online subcultures. Mental health awareness and the limits of the system beyond the horror and mystery, the Slenderman case shone an unflinching light on adolescent mental health. Morgan Geyser's diagnosis of early-onset schizophrenia was a central factor in understanding the crime, but it also highlighted systemic failures. Schizophrenia in children is extremely rare and often difficult to diagnose early. Symptoms such as hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia can be confused with typical teenage mood swings or dismissed entirely. Morgan's illness was not recognized or treated adequately before the stabbing, despite warning signs. Mental health advocates pointed to this gap as a critical issue. Children with severe psychiatric disorders often fall through the cracks, especially when their families lack resources or knowledge to seek specialized help. The case prompted a nationwide conversation about improving early intervention, access to mental health services, and reducing the stigma that keeps families from seeking care. Schools, doctors, and social workers were urged to become better equipped at spotting warning signs and providing support before crises occurred. Moreover, the legal handling of Morgan and Anissa brought to light the complex intersection of juvenile justice and mental health treatment. Their sentences emphasized treatment over punishment, reflecting a growing recognition that some crimes are deeply intertwined with mental illness and require rehabilitation rather than incarceration. Community impact and healing for the small town of Waukesha. The attack was deeply traumatic. Neighbors, families, and schools struggled to come to terms with what had happened among people they thought they knew well. The community's response was multifaceted. Vigils were held to support Peyton's recovery and to send a message of solidarity against violence. Counseling services were expanded for students and families affected by the incident. Local leaders emphasized the need for compassion and understanding in the aftermath, encouraging residents to support one another through healing. The case also sparked conversations about how communities can better protect and nurture their youth. Mental health resources, internet safety education, and awareness campaigns became priorities for schools and local government. Yet the story left lingering unease. The notion that such darkness could exist among children so young, fueled by a seemingly fictional monster, unsettled many. Parents became more vigilant, but also more fearful, worried not just about external dangers, but about the unseen psychological battles their children might face. Reflections on childhood, innocence and evil at its core, the Slenderman stabbing forced society to confront difficult questions about childhood and evil. The crime challenged the comforting idea that children are innocent and immune from the capacity to harm or be harmed in extreme ways. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred as Anissa and Morgan emerged as both victims of delusions, mental illness and online obsession, perpetrators of a violent, calculated attack on their friend. This complexity made the story resonate beyond its immediate facts. It spoke to fears about the loss of innocence in a digital world, the fragility of the human mind, and the unpredictable consequences of unchecked myth and fantasy. Psychologists noted that while not all children exposed to violent or supernatural content would become dangerous, the Slenderman case illustrated how the right mix of mental illness, social isolation, and immersion in dark fantasy could produce tragedy. Legacy and lessons. Years after the stabbing, the Slenderman case remains a touchstone for discussions on true crime, internet culture, and youth mental health. Peyton Leutner has moved forward with her life, embodying resilience and strength. Anissa and Morgan continue receiving treatment, their futures uncertain but closely watched by legal and medical professionals. The story continues to be taught and examined, not just as a sensational crime, but as a cautionary tale. It underscores the importance of vigilance in protecting children's mental health and safety, online and offline. The case also challenges us to think critically about the stories we tell and share, the myths we create, and the power they hold over vulnerable minds. In a world increasingly shaped by digital connection, where fantasy and reality intertwine seamlessly, the Slenderman stabbing stands as a tragic reminder. Not all monsters lurk in the shadows outside. Sometimes they hide in the minds of the young, fed by stories and fears that spiral out of control. The Slenderman stabbing case didn't just shock the nation when it happened, it continued to provoke debate, soul-searching and legal challenges for years afterward. As the dust settled on the immediate trauma, the story shifted focus toward justice, rehabilitation, and the broader lessons society could draw from such a tragic event. This final part delves into the legal outcomes for those involved, the controversies surrounding their treatment, and how the case reshaped thinking about youth crime and mental health in America. The legal battle, navigating juvenile justice and mental illness. One of the most complicated and debated aspects of the Slenderman stabbing case was how the justice system handled the perpetrators, Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser. Both were just 12 years old at the time of the attack, an age at which the capacity for criminal intent and full understanding of consequences is still developing. Immediately following their arrests, prosecutors faced a dilemma, charging two preteens with attempted first-degree murder in a case that was as much about mental illness and delusion as it was about violence. The defense teams argued that Morgan's diagnosed schizophrenia meant she lacked the ability to fully comprehend her actions, while Anissa's involvement was influenced by her susceptibility to Morgan's delusions. The case became a focal point for juvenile justice reform advocates, who argued that children should be treated differently from adults, especially when serious mental health issues are involved. Ultimately, after a series of hearings, it was decided that both girls would be tried as juveniles, but would undergo a lengthy period of psychological evaluation and treatment. The courts aimed to strike a balance between accountability for their violent actions and recognition that they were victims of untreated mental illness and environmental factors. In 2017, both Anissa and Morgan entered plea deals. Anissa Weier pleaded guilty to attempted second-degree intentional homicide and was sentenced to 7 years in a mental health institution. Morgan Geyser, whose schizophrenia was a critical factor, pleaded guilty to the same charge and was committed to a psychiatric facility for up to 10 years. The sentences reflected a focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment, with the hope that treatment could help them reintegrate into society someday. Controversies and public opinion. The sentences sparked mixed reactions from the public and victims' advocates. Some believed the girls received lenient treatment, given the brutality of the crime. Others argued that locking up children with serious mental illness without proper therapeutic support would be ineffective and even cruel. Peyton Leutner, the victim, remained publicly silent on many aspects of the case, focusing instead on her recovery and personal healing. Her family emphasized forgiveness and education, hoping the tragedy would serve as a warning and a catalyst for positive change. The case also ignited debates about parental responsibility and school oversight. Critics questioned whether more should have been done to recognize the girls' mental health struggles and prevent the attack. Others pointed to the broader societal failure to address the mental health crisis among youth, especially in underserved or isolated communities. Mental health treatment and rehabilitation, both Anissa and Morgan's time in mental health facilities, involved extensive therapy, medication management, and educational programs. Treatment plans were individualized, focusing on addressing psychotic symptoms, impulse control, social skills, and cognitive development. Their progress was closely monitored by psychologists, social workers, and legal authorities. Regular reviews determined whether they were ready for gradual reintegration into the community through supervised visits, and eventually, controlled release. The treatment approach reflected advances in adolescent psychiatry, recognizing that early intervention could reduce the risk of recidivism and improve long-term outcomes. However, it also acknowledged the deep challenges involved. Mental illness at such a young age can cause lasting trauma and disability, and full recovery is never guaranteed. Impact on schools, parents, and internet safety. The Slenderman stabbing sparked widespread educational reforms, especially in schools. Many districts introduced programs to teach students about internet safety, mental health awareness, and how to seek help for troubling thoughts and behaviors. Parents became more engaged in monitoring their children's online activity and encouraging open communication about fears, obsessions, or troubling content. Many schools partnered with mental health professionals to provide early screening and support for students exhibiting signs of distress. Internet platforms also faced renewed scrutiny. The role of anonymous forums, creepypasta stories, and unregulated chat rooms came under fire. Although Slenderman originated as a fictional character, created on the Something Awful forum in 2009, the way such myths spread unchecked to impressionable minds raised serious concerns. This led to increased calls for better content moderation, parental controls, and public awareness campaigns about distinguishing fiction from reality online. The enduring myth of Slenderman, despite the horrific crime tied to its name, Slenderman as a myth did not vanish. On the contrary, the character remained embedded in popular culture, spawning countless fan stories, videos, and adaptations in books, games, and movies. The paradox was clear. A fictional entity that inspired real-life violence became even more powerful in the collective imagination. For some, Slenderman symbolized the dangers of unchecked imagination and the dark corners of internet culture. For others, it was a compelling modern monster myth that reflected contemporary anxieties. The stabbing case forever altered how Slenderman was perceived. What began as a creative horror meme turned into a chilling example of how fantasy could blur into deadly reality. Lessons learned, and the road ahead. The Slenderman stabbing remains a landmark case in understanding the intersection of juvenile crime, mental illness, and digital culture. It underscored the importance of early identification and treatment of childhood mental illness to prevent tragedies. Responsible media coverage that avoids sensationalism while informing the public. Parental and educational involvement in children's online lives. Judicial approaches that balance justice with compassion and rehabilitation. Continued research into how myths and stories can influence vulnerable minds. Ultimately, the story calls for empathy and vigilance. It reminds us that children, no matter how young, may carry unseen burdens and face threats that go beyond the physical world. It's a cautionary tale for a digital era, where the boundaries between reality and fantasy are increasingly porous, and where monsters may be conjured not only by folklore, but by the flickering glow of a screen.